Whether on the field, on the court, or on the balance beam, there's more to winning than the final score. Hi, I'm Patrick Manning of Black Desert Resort. We recognize the effort it takes to succeed. That's why we are proud to partner with Utah Checkdown, the podcast that tells you the story before the game, then gives you a recap of what happened when it's all over, the grit, the glory, and the disappointments. Join us for stories of Utah's finest athletes and coaches. Thanks for listening.
You're listening to the Utah Checkdown podcast. And now your host, Josh Furlong.
Welcome back to another edition of the Utah Checkdown podcast. I am Josh Furlong. Happy to be with you today. It was a good weekend. It was a fun weekend, we'll say. A lot of things happened for the University of Utah, and most of it was good. So from a Utah perspective, that's always a good thing, right? All right, so let's jump in. Let me first tell you about our partners, Black Desert. Black Desert Resort isn't just your home. It's an endless retreat where your life is played your way. From intimate studios to spacious four-bedroom suites. The raw beauty of southern Utah is your new backyard. Discover its championship golf course, exquisite dining, and world-class outdoor adventures, all yours to conquer. This is luxury your way. Learn more about owning a luxury residence at blackdesertresort.com. Come play, come stay. All right, let's jump into this. So, last week, we found out the dates for spring football. Spring football is back, and I know that's, a mixed review for some people. Some want spring football to go away. Just because it's watered down football, right? Others, they enjoy it. I'm kind of somewhere in the middle. I like to be able to talk football. I think it's fun. I think most Utah fans, they pay attention more to football than most other things. And so anytime you can talk about football, I think it's a good thing. And so for me, it's always fun to be able to talk football, kind of see how things are shaping up and different things that way. Unfortunately, this is the time of the year where I help coach one of my sons in baseball, and we travel. So I don't always get to a ton of the spring practices or availabilities, which is kind of hard for my job, but we make do. So selfishly, that's the hard part. But my time with my kids playing this is coming to a close soon. So I'm an old man, and that's the nature of life. Anyways, so spring football is back, at least in a month. So the opening day of spring camp will be on March 20th. So we still got a little bit. You're still going to go through, the basketball season, NCAA tournament, depending on if, anything happens locally in the NCAA tournament, then maybe there's still some things going on. But for the most part, this is after that. For the spring season, you're only allowed 15 practices from the NCAA, and that counts the spring game. So the spring game this year will be on April 19th. Kyle has obviously watered this down a bit to be able to make sure that he's giving more of his depth players some time and not necessarily going to his proven players, but at the same rate with the transfer portal and Utah at more than a 50% turnover, this becomes an interesting place to be able to see a lot of these new faces, right? And, Kyle's not going to make the decision to make, Devin Dampier live, right? Like, you're just not going to do it. It's not worth it. Most likely you're not going to make some other people like an Isaac Wilson live. Maybe you are. Maybe you want to see him now and how he's sped up. I don't know. I'd be curious to see what happens there. But there's a growing trend throughout all of college football where these spring games may go away, where the coaches there's paranoia in coaching, right? You want to make sure that you can keep everything yours, and especially in the transfer portal era, where when the transfer portal opens up right around that time, you don't want to be highlighting some of these players that may be under the radar, or some of these other guys that could then essentially go to the transfer portal and be off your team. Granted, this transfer portal season is generally much quieter. For a guy to leave, it's not that it's impossible, but it's just harder, right? You're kind of transferring into a situation that is different. You haven't had a lot of lead up time, so I'm not saying it's out of the realm. I haven't gotten any indications from Kyle that things will change based on what he's done. Obviously, it's been more watered down. The defenses aren't showing a ton, but that's not to say that they couldn't do more to limit that. So really curious to see how this spring goes. In the spring, we're often given more opportunities to see full practices, or at least a good chunk of practice. So that's an advantage for us as media that we don't get in the fall. Not that it will matter a whole ton, but at least you get to see some of these guys and how they operate in practice. And I think the advantage that comes with that is simply being able to see how a guy works. There's several players that, you see on a Saturday and you look at, and why aren't they getting the ball more? Maybe they're in the starting 11 or whatever it may be, but they're not really producing as well as you thought they would. Or maybe they're in the second unit or third unit and they're not getting a lot of touches, or they're not seeing a lot of field time. You can see in practice sometimes why that's the case, right? And I think spring is a challenge because some of these guys are just acclimating to a new system, and so it's hard to take full things there. But you can also see kind of who is really wanting to separate. Spring is kind of that time where maybe some of these underclassmen players who have been sitting on the bench, and this is in years past because now you're starting to get less and less of that, but some of these guys are on the bench and they haven't really gotten a lot of time. This is where you can see some of these guys start to pop off, right? And you start to see them having the success that they were projected to be. For example, last year, Mike Mitchell had a phenomenal spring camp, right? Like he really highlighted himself in being able to do different things, and was expected to be this guy in fall. And there's nothing to say that he wasn't, but that's where you kind of see that work ethic come out, where you kind of find out how a guy is doing. Once again, it doesn't always translate to fall because things change, different players, different things are going on. But at the same time, you're kind of seeing that work ethic. And if a guy is really hustling and trying to push to make a spot in spring, generally speaking, that's going to trend well for fall, right? Other players are going to join the roster in fall. Other things are going to happen. And obviously, once you get into real season mode, the coaching staff is much more tuned into wanting to make sure that they've got consistency, and they're not just giving a guy a shot just to give him a shot, right? This is where they're preparing for the season. The time for you to kind of grow and kind of highlight yourself is kind of already passed in some respects. And so that's what this spring opportunity is for. And so it's fun to be able to see that, to see how these guys participate and how they work, to see how coaches are talking about them. Last year, I remember going into spring camp, looking at this, and there was a lot of questions based on the secondary, right? And I feel like the secondary is always a place that there's going to be questions. And I think Morgan Scally kind of takes, he definitely takes pride in that Utah is able to always answer that call. But I think it kind of bugs him to some extent that the media is always doubting him, right? That it's always like, look, we've done this consistently for years. Why do we keep getting these questions? And that's not to say that these questions aren't valid and these questions aren't real. But I think that's always the nature of this business, where you're always looking to see where, or who is going to step up, right? You lose guys that have been producers and have been effective for a team, and now suddenly you've got to be able to replace that. And so I'm really curious to see kind of how that shapes up, see what goes on and kind of happens there. So really fascinated by that, and looking forward to it. Like I said, I'll do my best at spring, but this is the time where I'm out of town a lot of the times traveling with my kids, or, if a team is still in the NCAA tournament. Generally it's been the women. Well, it has been the women the last few years. That may preclude me from going to practices, but we'll balance that. We'll still talk about that here, right? I still get some audio, and I still get some stuff from practice, so there'll be opportunities to be able to talk about football. And we'll get into that and enjoy it. I've got a whole schedule for the remainder of the offseason where we'll kind of break down some of these things, breaking down spring camps, the NFL draft. We'll go into position breakdowns this summer, and then we'll go back into the schedule breakdowns of each team like we did last year, where we did kind of looking at two teams and what what they're going to present, a little deeper look. So that'll kind of be what we do throughout the year. This will continue to have some football elements into it, even when we get into those dog days of summer when it's like, June, July, where it feels like nothing's happening. There's no sports on. We're still going to talk football. So we'll continue that. Continuing with the football theme, this last week has been a very busy week for 2026 recruits setting their official plans, official visiting plans to the University of Utah. It's been busy, and it's going to grow. But right now, Utah has about 16 athletes that have committed to visiting Utah on an official basis, anywhere between April to June. Some will be coming for the spring game and being able to check that out. Others will be, coming later. June is generally the busiest month of visitors, but may get some of that. And so it's going to be interesting to see how Utah, who they bring in, what they're focusing in on, and different things there. As we did last year, we'll continue to look at this and kind of see how things go. But these official visitors are very important for Utah, who is trying to, commit a majority of its class this offseason, right? They're trying to get them in the summer so that when that early signing day, which has essentially been the signing day, they can get those guys and they don't have to worry about it. Then you focus on 27 and you're moving on, right? There's still stuff to do with 26 and you're still trying to keep that. But you want to make sure that you're keeping an eye on that and you've got this solidified. Now, with that being said, these recruiting classes and bringing in talent, I'm curious to see if it dwindles a little bit. Utah had the most visitors ever in school history last year, but in the same, and they had a big class, and so that made a lot of sense to be able to want to have a lot of incoming freshmen. But as the age of the transfer portal continues and there's more things that go into that, there's a lot of schools out there that are focusing a ton more resources on the transfer portal, where they're looking at it and saying, this is what we're going to do. We're going to focus on that instead of focusing solely on high school recruiting. Now, you always have to get high school recruits, but it was Deion Sanders that said last season, that he's like, I can take a whole bunch of these guys from the freshman season, but majority of those guys aren't going to play that first year. And so then after that first year, they get into our system, they understand what we're doing, and then they go transfer somewhere else. They've already invested a ton of time. Now, that's not to say that he's not willing to invest time in these freshmen, but when you can go get guys in the transfer portal where that you're bringing them in generally to play, he feels like the investment is better in the transfer portal, and has obviously had some success there. Utah so far still hasn't kind of gone away from that high school area, right? Like they want to invest in the high school athletes. They want to be able to bring them in. They still want to bring in, as many high recruits that they can, try to get those 4-star, maybe a 5-star they've never had before, but try to get those to be able to come in while still looking at the transfer portal. And I'm curious to see, as, we're getting closer to the days where Kyle Whittingham will no longer coach, how that translates to what Morgan Scalley wants to do, right? Does Morgan want to focus more on the transfer portal? Is he more on the, on the freshmen, trying to bring them in from the high school ranks? That's still TBD. He's a guy that has spent the lifeblood, or recruiting has been the lifeblood of his tenure at Utah. He's been one of Utah's best recruiting coaches. And so I don't think that he's going to go away from that. He understands the relationships and trying to build guys through that process. But with that said, he also understands that the transfer portal is a necessary thing that needs to happen. So curious to see how these are balanced out, how, obviously Kyle is still the coach and he's going to be the one with the deciding factors here. But I'm curious to see how this will change over the years, especially, let's say that this is Kyle's last year. This recruiting class right here is essentially for Morgan Scalley, right? And so I'm curious to see if there's any directions that we're going to get there. I'm hoping to ask those types of questions in spring camp and see what we can get, seeing how that is managed. But this is going to be a busy offseason. There's going to be a lot of recruits here, a lot of people that we'll be talking up. A lot of these guys don't really have even full evaluations from these recruiting services. As I've said in the past, I generally defer to 24/7 Sports. That's not to say these other services don't have their value, and I look at them, but I think 24/7 does a more complete job of evaluating these guys, compared to everything else. So I've stuck with that. On3 is good. They've got some things. There's some wonky things with On3. Rivals the same thing. But I think from a complete picture, I generally stick to 24/7. So when I talk about rankings or a guy is rated a 4-star, 3-star, whatever it may be, that's generally where I'm coming from. So what you've got this year so far is the focus, at least early, has been on quarterbacks and offensive line. There's other position groups, obviously, and they've got other guys coming in, whether that be in the defensive backs. They've got 2 linebackers already committed, not committed, excuse me, committed to visiting officially. That nobody's committed for this class yet, but you've got a lot of those things. Not a lot of skills players on this list. You've got mostly the quarterbacks that they're focusing in on. I think you can see from a skills perspective, getting a wide receiver or a running back, even tight ends, have generally been better through the transfer portal. You see kind of their talent, see what's going on. And I'm not saying that that's the direction that Utah's fully investing in, but based on the kids that are being, set up for official visits, that's kind of been the trend. You're looking for the trenches. You're looking for your quarterback, kind of maturing a kid through that process. So right now, Utah has 4 quarterbacks that they're focusing on. One of them has already taken an official visit, and that was in October. That's Brady Palmer from California. There was a lot of optimism about him, leaning towards Utah and having a lot of praise there. This was also before Utah changed its offensive staff. And so, I haven't gotten an update on how that picture looks. I would have to imagine, that there's other quarterbacks that Utah's looking at right now as well that are going to be in that mix. 2 of those are going to be Peyton Falzone. He's a 4-star kid from Pennsylvania, an area that Utah just doesn't recruit, right? Like, it is just not an area Utah recruits. But with Jason Beck spending time in Syracuse, this became an instant connection that these 2 had. And so this is kind of a holdover from Jason Beck, of being able to use that recruiting arm that he had there. 4-star kid, talented, one of the highest ranked kids in this recruiting class that Utah has scheduled to officially visit right now. Obviously would be a tremendous talent there. You also have Oscar Rios from California. He's coming on June 6th. Peyton Falzone is coming April 17th, or at least that weekend. I say these dates, but they're usually that weekend. Some might be a day, some might be a couple days, but they're that weekend. So Peyton will be here for the spring game. Oscar Rios, June 6th. Another 4-star quarterback, getting a lot of attention from a lot of big programs. So, curious there. And then you also have Caleb Maryland visiting on June 13th, so a week later. He's from Texas, 3-star quarterback. So, yeah, you've got 4 QBs that they've essentially identified. That's not to say that there couldn't be others or that some, fall out of the mix. But I think this is kind of what you're looking at of who they're going to be focusing in on. Really curious to see how Jason Beck's influence wins out here. I think there's been a lot of optimism about him and kind of who he is as a play caller, what he's done, especially this last year with Devin Dampier and needing a guy that is dual threat, where he's not afraid to run, but he's definitely going to hone in on passing. A guy that focuses on the strength of his quarterback, is not set to one strategy. And so I think that becomes very telling for a quarterback. And obviously, if you can back that up this year with success on the field and continues, if Utah has a similar season for Devin Dampier as New Mexico did in terms of his offensive production, this becomes a very attractive place for quarterbacks and offensive players to be able to come. So, you're getting these guys early. You want them to feel good. They want to be able to see Salt Lake City and get a good vibe here. By the way, Peyton Falzone took an unofficial visit here in January. He's already been here. He's seen it. He's been able to talk to the coaching staff. From all accounts, I haven't interviewed him, but from other people that have said that he really enjoyed his time here. So, really curious to see how this goes and what Utah's able to do with this, and being able to work that way. And then for the other kind of focus right now is offensive line. They have 4 players that have been in the mix there. The biggest name is a local kid from Corner Canyon, Isan Tafa, June 20th. He's a 4-star kid, is getting a lot of attention. Utah's in the mix, but they're definitely not. I don't want to say they're not leading, but I think there's a lot of programs out there that are really pushing hard. When you can get one of these high-end offensive linemen, that's a real valuable asset to be able to have. And so you're going to see a lot of people come after him. He's the 4th highest ranked player from the state of Utah. Utah's obviously had recent success with being able to get those guys that have done well. Look no further than Spencer Fano, who has really shown that if you invest and, that Utah and Jim Harding have been able to be effective for you. I mean, there's a real possibility that Fano, goes to the NFL after this next season. He was one of the best tackles in the league last year. He's going to come into this year with a ton of praise. Going to be in a lot of those award categories where people are going to look at him as one of the top offensive linemen in the country. If you can use that, use that with Caleb Lomu, if Isaiah Garcia can get in the line this year after being injured last year, that kind of shows that Utah has a place for you if you're going to come in and you can produce, right? And so really curious to see what happens there, what they do with the trenches. But that's going to be Utah's focus early on, right? Like there's going to be some other guys that they get in the mix for, but that's been the focus early right now is in quarterbacks and the trench play. You do have some other guys, D-line. You've got, one defensive lineman, one defensive end, two linebackers that have said that they're going to be coming. So you're mostly focusing in on those trench plays type positions, and we'll kind of see from there. So that's it for that. We'll continue to review that. Like I said, we're still going to get more this week probably of guys announcing their official visits. It's going to be a busy offseason in Utah, for the month especially of June. They're going to be hosting a ton of athletes and getting a lot of guys through this program to be able to see. As I mentioned, this is where a lot of the guys that they have signed for that last class committed. So if you can get a lot of these guys in on an official visit, you can get them committed to the program early and kind of keep them, quote unquote, indoctrinated into the program. That bodes well, generally speaking, for an opportunity to sign them. And the recruiting window is going to change here and everything. But this is an opportunity for all schools, not just Utah, to really be able to make an emphasis on how they approach recruiting. So as you've seen, and as I've mentioned, Utah's done more each year to be able to get a lot of these guys in, try to get a lot of talent. They've been in the mix with 5-star guys that have been coming into the program. They're trying their best to be able to highlight what Salt Lake City is. And honestly, there's no better time to see Salt Lake City than in the summer. So it's a great opportunity to see all that Utah provides. And this is a great selling point for the U as they go through this and trying to help guys commit. So we'll continue to focus in on that. Transitioning a little bit to basketball, let's be real. Like the Runnin Utes, we've talked about them on the podcast where I think the last podcast all I said was woof, right? Like they've struggled, right? It hasn't been the best of times for Utah basketball, at least to the men's side, and it's been a challenge. And it's a roster that I said doesn't always have a star, and especially if Gabe Madsen is not hitting his shots, Utah has really struggled. Obviously, you've had Ezra Asar, who has done well to be able to kind of be that secondary guy, the guy that really is forcing his way in the post and kind of setting the tone. But Utah has needed more of that type of playmaking to be able to be effective. And, they just went through one of their easier stretches, right? None of these games in the Big 12 are easy. But they went through one of their stretches where on paper it looked like they could have a better opportunity to win, whether that was with Cincinnati or West Virginia. Both of these are tough teams, right? So it's not like these are teams ranked in the 300s or even the 100s by all means. These are teams that are good. Cincinnati's been on the bubble at times. West Virginia, they've had some success and have been able to be there. This has been two teams that are good. And you're doing that on the road. That's not always an easy thing. However, the last week, these games just didn't go Utah's way. They're in the mix for a little bit, then they make their mistakes, and then they go on scoring slumps, and then things don't work, right? And so you drop games that in theory were going to be your easy ones, the ones that you were going to come into and say, hey, you can win these. You're obviously going to take your lumps against, Kansas or Kansas State or, any of these other top tier teams, and you'll be on your way. And that's what most teams in the Big 12 do, right? Like these higher end teams, generally speaking, aren't going to, they're not going to be the easy ones. It was the same when Utah was in the Pac-12, and you always knew every time you went up against Arizona, you're just going to take your lumps for the most part, right? There's those years where Utah was really competitive with them, and Utah's beat them in years when they haven't been competitive either. So, I mean, it happens, but for the most part, you've got to win the games that you're expected to win, or at least on the table to win, and then, you're going to try to fight in some of these other games. Well, Utah drops those. The morale around this team has been, not with the team itself, but with the fan base, has been tough. It's been a long time, right? And Craig Smith has had this program for 4 years now, and I know there's a lot of talk about needing to let him go because of the frustrations there, that, Utah's not getting better. This program is spiraling. It's not going anywhere. And I get it, right? There's a lot of frustrations there, and everybody's trying to point the fingers, and you want to be able to have the Utah team that was back in the glory days of the 90s of Rick Majerus. And unfortunately, it just hasn't been that way. Larry Kraskowiak had it for a little bit and obviously had his own successes. But then Utah let him go, and now you're kind of trying to figure out a new path. So this is the nature of where Utah's at. And I've always said that at the end of the day, Utah has to decide if they want to invest in men's basketball. And there's times where it feels like they're trying, but for the most part, it's just another team that, they're trying to get by on. And I don't think that Craig Smith has gotten the full advantage that he could have, but at the same vein, there are some things that Craig Smith has done, and he's a little bit all over the place, that hasn't allowed him to be able to have the success that he needs. And so there's a combination here. But at the end of the day, he continues to find a team that buys into him. This year, especially with how things have gone, Gabe Madsen going through a tremendous shooting slump where it just seems like nothing was happening. Couldn't really hit anything. Teams were losing. The games weren't being played well. There was games where you're only scoring 30 points. I mean, it's been a rough sled for this team at times, and still they continue to fight for each other. They're locked in. They really do have a chemistry with each other, and it's not just saying that. They continue to work. And so, for whatever that means, Utah has been able to find its own successes. And then on Saturday, in the late game, decided to go and upset the number 17 team in the country in Kansas. Kansas at one point was ranked the number 1 team in the country. Obviously, this is a team that is not there, right? Like they're good, but they're not the Kansas of old where you're looking at this team where they're just unstoppable. That's not to say that this Kansas team wasn't good, but at the same time, they're not that same upper echelon team, even though the day that they lost in the NCAA preview, where the selection committee puts out, their early top 16 teams, Kansas is in that mix at 15. They're in there. They're in a top 4 seed. And, then they go and lay an egg to Utah. So Utah wins the game 74-67. This is a game where Utah never trailed. They were tied up 4 times in the game, but Utah never trailed. And there was so many times where I was waiting for Kansas to take the lead. And I felt like once they took the lead, it was kind of going to be game over for Utah, right? There was these moments where Utah would just have, these lulls in scoring, at 1.7 minutes. And by then they had a 10-point lead, and so that kind of gave them the cushion they need. And Kansas just wasn't able to get into the game plan that it wanted for itself. But there was these moments where, okay, the game's tied or Utah's up by 1 or whatever the case may be, and they shoot a 3-pointer or they have a shot and it rims out, and it just like it wasn't happening for Kansas. But I felt like the general vibe obviously was in Utah's favor, and the momentum was there despite poor shooting. I mean, they only shot 37% for the game. It wasn't great. But at the same time, the momentum was there for Utah, right? You had a fan base that was involved. You had guys that were engaged, and they were giving their all to be able to compete against the 17th best team in the country, at least on paper. And Kansas, for whatever reason, could never steal that momentum. Like I said, there was enough fans there that I think that if you could have gotten a lead from Kansas, whether it be 1 point or 3 points, that very well could have been a backbreaker. And it's easy to say right now, knowing the result, but I think the general vibe there is, you've seen that with these Utah teams where they can build up a 10-point lead or an 11. They got to 11 against Kansas, and then suddenly they go on these scoring droughts and they can't get anything to go, and then the team goes up by 2 or 3, and then you go into a timeout break, and it's like, okay, we're settling it, and then suddenly that team explodes for a 7-9 point run, and the game's over, right? And then Utah's on their heels trying to come back and come win a game that they were leading the entire time. That's what I was kind of expecting in this game based on the blueprint that we've seen for Utah this year. They've been in the mix with some of these teams, right? They've been, heavily involved with a close game with some of these top teams in the Big 12 for much of the game, and then they find a way to lose it, and then they get blown out. It's kind of been the MO. That's what's happened. But it never happened. Kansas was never able to get over that hump and never able to get over that hurdle of where they needed to go. And Utah continued to find momentum. Ezra Asar broke up two long scoring droughts that allowed them to really kind of refocus and settle. And then suddenly Utah went back up on their run and everything was going to be okay. The crazy part here is that Utah out-rebounded Kansas 16-6 on offensive rebounds, and that was a huge decider in this game. You have Hunter Dickinson, who comes into the game for Kansas, who, years ago he was talked about as, being in the draft and a first rounder and all this type of stuff, and he's continued to stay in the league and continues to kind of develop his game, but he's honestly one of the biggest threats in the post in the conference, right? He's a guy that can really impact a game. When he can consistently put up 20 points on a night, that kind of shows the effect that he has. But Utah managed to get, the boards. They found a way to do that. They were actually equal on defensive rebounding, so both teams had, I think it was 30 rebounds each. But offensively, Utah did a tremendous job of being able to win the battles on the offensive side of the ball to give themselves second chance opportunities, and it translated to a win. Bill Self, which is Kansas coach, longtime coach, he said the biggest emphasis was points off of turnovers and rebounding. Those were his two big factors where they lost the game. And Kansas, they only had 12 turnovers, but it turned into 22 points for Utah. That's usually the opposite for Utah, right? They're the ones turning over the ball, and then the other team expands that lead tremendously because of the points off of turnovers. Utah flipped the script, and they did it to them. And then on top of that, defensively, Utah did a lot of shifting, where they've talked a lot about this over the years, where they like to call themselves positionless players, right? Where you can guard 1 through 5. Somebody like a Caleb Lohner who comes in, who, by the way, he hasn't been in the game for, I think, 3 games. He hasn't gotten any minutes. Has been on the back of the bench, really hasn't gotten anything after playing a bit, and then suddenly comes in and has one of his best defensive nights of the season, where he comes in there and he's absolutely impacted the game. But a guy like him, he absolutely can transition from 1 through 5, right? He can guard any single one of those guys. And so it made it very effective for Utah, where a lot of the times they go under the screen, and then that gives enough space for the guy to pop off for either a short jumper or a 3-pointer, and then that allows this team to be able to build momentum. For Utah, this time they did a tremendous job of being able to switch. And so whenever that guy went off the screen, somebody else was there to pick him up, and they played great defense. There wasn't a lot of drop-off. Now, that's not to say that, Kansas didn't have guys that could beat Utah or that they got around that defense. But for the most part, and especially against Dickinson, Utah did a tremendous job of being able to keep him out of the post. And as a guy that works a ton in the post and impacts the game, where Kansas is much different than a lot of these other Big 12 teams, where they work inside out instead of relying solely on guard play, that was the game for Utah, right? They allowed they forced Kansas to be able to take shots that they normally probably wouldn't take, especially with Dickinson. They forced him out of the post. They got offensive rebounds. They got points off of turnovers. They took control of the game, despite how bad it felt at times. Like there was times where it just was not a great looking basketball game. But at the same time, they found a way to be able to be successful. And to me, like as I was sitting there watching this team on Saturday, it was just kind of frustrating, right? And I say frustrating in the sense that you see a team where, okay, now at home, they've beaten Kansas, who was a ranked opponent at the time. I know the AP poll just came out right now, and I can't really see it as I'm doing this podcast. Maybe I can look at that as I'm talking. But you have a team in Kansas, who's ranked. They've obviously had success. There's a lot of things that were going their way, and you beat them on your home turf. Okay, cool. Home turf is usually easier. But, you're still there. Kansas, by the way, dropped to 23rd in the AP ratings. I was able to talk and read. Imagine that. Anyways, but you have a team that is ranked in the top 25. You beat them. You have a BYU team. Now, at the time, that was once again not the prettiest of games. Anybody leaving the Huntsman Center from that game was not looking at that game as, a history of success in basketball. It was tough at times, right? Similar to this Kansas game. But I think that's where Utah is finding success, is just muck up the game, right? Find a way to get dirty. But going back to that point, it's frustrating to watch because you've got a team that can compete with these these teams that are either ranked or they're highly ranked or close, to whatever that may be. BYU has obviously had a great turnaround since that loss to Utah and has been in the mix of a lot of these games. You've got the talent. You've got the talent to be able to compete, and I'm not saying that it's going to be an every night thing where Utah should be in the mix, but then you have these games where you just no-show, where that attention to detail and the attention to the game plan, it doesn't fit the same, right? As Craig Smith said, everybody should be getting up for the number 17 team in the country, right? Like, that's just a natural thing. Like, coming into the Huntsman Center, there's just a natural vibe walking into that arena. You walk in, you start seeing a bunch of blue because you see Kansas fans who, obviously a blue blood of college basketball. Utah fans, I have a brother-in-law who's a Kansas fan. He was there at the game. He was actually wearing Utah gear, surprisingly. But you have these people that have been watching a team like Kansas or Kentucky or Duke or North Carolina, and so when they come to town, they're going to check them out. And so there's this palpable buzz about what's going on the floor, right? And you're expecting your team, especially if you're a Kansas fan, to just come wipe Utah up and down, right? Because Utah hasn't played very well. And so you come into this game, though, and there's this palpable buzz, and the players are locked in, and they're doing things the right way, right? Like, they're dialed in, they're wanting to finish, and they're doing all these things, and then you go in and win. But, there's nothing to say that can't happen for when you're playing West Virginia or Cincinnati or Baylor. Baylor's obviously been good, and they're in there. But, you've got these teams that they're no less different, right? They're not anything different. Like, the Big 12 is a tough conference, and it's not the Big 12 of the last few years where it's, every single team feels like that they're, could be ranked. The SEC has taken that status this year, but it's still a good conference where they continue to beat you down and they continue to do things in a tough way where, you're not getting your standard Thursday, Saturday, Thursday, Sunday games. You're going all over. So you may have a day off. You may have 4 days off. You may have 1 day. You know what I mean? This is a tough break. And to be able to do that is great, but it's frustrating to be able to see the potential of this team because they do have potential. They can be in the mix, but it just honestly depends on who's going to show up that day or if they're not going to turn over the ball or you know what I mean? It's a challenge. So interesting team. That was a lot of rambling for not a lot of, stuff for you, but still, trying to give you your, the assessment of the team. This is a team. It was funny to see people on Twitter after they beat, and I'm not even talking Utah fans, I'm talking national people, is half-heartedly kind of joking about Utah being 2 games out from Kansas, right? They now they're 2 games away from each other, which is wild to think in the standings. But you had some other people saying, with a few more wins, maybe Utah could be on the bubble. This is the thing, right? The NCAA tournament is the guide, right? Everybody goes for that. That is the success story. And obviously in the Big 12, you're going to find yourself having a lot more leeway where you can lose more and still have an opportunity to be in the tournament. The Pac-12 never got that same respect because it was always looked down as a watered down conference, right? And so you could go through and you could lose the same amount in the Pac-12 as you could in the Big 12. And just from a perception standpoint, many were just going to look at that and say that it wasn't, the same. And quite honestly, it wasn't, right? The Pac-12 had a lot of great teams, Oregon, Arizona, UCLA, USC, whatever it may be, depending on the year. But the rest of the league was just kind of mugh. And so you didn't really get a lot of success if you lost in those games. Whereas the Big 12, you could lose to the 12th team, the 16th team, and it's still going to generally be viewed as an okay loss, as long as you're not losing a ton. But it just has a different, prestige next to it just simply because of how successful the Big 12 has been. Now, with that said, like I said, these aren't necessarily Utah fans. I don't think there's any Utah fan out there that legitimately believes that this is an NCAA tournament team. And I'm not necessarily going to change your mind. I think you can have success and close out, but there is something to be said, with what Gabe Madsen said after the end of the game, who, by the way, he made 5 3-pointers, became the all-time leading 3-point record holder at Utah, had finished with 24 points, 3 rebounds. He's found his groove as of late. The game before, he made 8 3-pointers, and somehow Utah still lost. Some of that was because of him, because he just continued to shoot, and he acknowledges that. But he said after the game that at the end of the day, this is just basketball, right? It doesn't really matter who's on the jersey or whoever it is. And obviously, you've got to have sustained consistency, but any team can win. Any team can get hot this time of the year and suddenly find a way to be able to make a run, right? Years ago, it was Oklahoma State. And granted, Oklahoma State was good, when we were watching in the Pac-12. It gave their coach a coaching extension simply because of how they were able to go on a run. But it took a team that once they believe in themselves and they can kind of, get on a run, they're incredibly hard to stop. And so then you run through the conference tournament and then you get into the NCAA tournament and you maybe make some noise there. Things can happen. So at this point, Utah's not an NCAA tournament team. And I think a lot would have to go their way, including winning out the rest of the year, also going deep into the Big 12 tournament. And even then, I don't even think that, I don't know. There's a lot going against Utah. And, they've kind of made their own bed that way. But there's not to say that they couldn't get there. You win enough of the right games, and maybe there's some consideration there. If you go down to Provo and you beat BYU again, you get some of these wins that beat Kansas State tonight. This is Monday. You go beat Kansas State again tonight. Maybe there's something there. So I don't know. Right now they're 11th in the Big 12. They were picked 16th, and I had always said that I could see them being a team that was probably around the 10th area. I think they're much better than 16th. But this is an opportunity where they can either decide they want to, continue to improve upon that, or they're going to let the moment overshadow them. And you go from beating Kansas to maybe getting blown out by Kansas State tonight. I don't think that will happen. I mean, Kansas State's a good team, right? I'm not saying that they're not. They were on a 6-game winning streak before BYU beat them on Saturday. But this is not like something where Utah's just suddenly, because they've won, that things are going to be great. But I think you're going to start to see the fight out of this Utah team. I've said that in the past, and then they went on a 4-game losing streak. So we'll see. But you do have, your resume isn't great. You've got you're 1-9 in quad 1 games. Okay. And maybe some of those you can point to as being close. Sure. Whatever. You're 3-2 in quad 2 games, and then you're undefeated in 3 and 4 quads. But this isn't necessarily a resume that speaks to success, right? Now, maybe if you finish, 4-9 or what, I don't know how many quad 1 games they have left. I'd have to go look at that schedule. But maybe you have some success, right? In the net, they're ranked 72nd. In KenPom, they're 78th. So they're still easily just on the outside based on that alone. But I think at this point, what Utah needs to aim for is trying to get a top 8 seed in the Big 12 tourney. You're 11th right now. You're only 1 game, from 8th place. So it's not that far of a stretch. And if you can get into that 8th place spot, you get a first round bye. Now that's suddenly not to a way to unlock Utah getting into the tournament. But I think it shows that if you can fight to get into the top 8, at least you were one of the better teams in the Big 12 to finish. Right? That's not to say that Utah was always the best team or anything, because they haven't. They're not. I'm not trying to polish a turd here. Let's be real. This is a scenario where Utah, even if everything goes their way, they very well could not get in the NCAA tournament. And I'm trying my best to be able to paint a picture where they could, even though, me saying that is very hard because I just don't see a chance. Regardless, if you can get into that top 8, that at least gives you another notch on the belt to be able to say, hey, look, we got a first round bye. Not that they have an argument to the committee. The committee's going to view it how they want. But if you can finish in the top 8 in the Big 12 in the regular season, and then you go win 1 or 2, you'd have to win a couple games to be able to be in that conversation. Maybe suddenly you've got a new look on you. And especially if you can turn it in a way where you're playing consistently, you're playing as a team that is together, there's a chance, right? There's always a chance until there's not. And so I'm curious to see how this goes. I don't want to say that Craig Smith is playing for his life right now, but I think there is a scenario where that's absolutely possible. I know there's not an appetite to want to buy out a contract, but at the same time, there's not been a lot of support either. And so Utah's kind of in this tough scenario where you need booster support, you need athletic support, but you also need wins on the floor, right? You got to get some wins. And so they're kind of in this chicken and egg scenario of who blinks first, so to speak. And so I think, anything that can help this Utah team is ultimately going to come down to winning. Now, that doesn't mean that boosters are suddenly going to throw money towards Craig Smith or to this program, or that the athletic department is going to change their stance and how they kind of do things. But at the same time, winning is a cure-all for a lot of things. Now, it may be a short-term solution, and as you see at times with coaches where they save themselves for a year and then suddenly it all goes to pot again the next year. But I think, you've got to at least be fighting, right? And I'm not saying that Craig isn't. He's always been a fighter. He's always wanted to be able to get the best teams, hasn't always had the best rosters. But I think if Utah has a chance, and I still think last year's roster probably gave them the best chance to be in the NCAA tournament until they had, sustained injuries with Raleigh Wooster. This is their opportunity, right? And if you can take this Kansas game and you can translate that into some more wins, you go beat Kansas State tonight. Yeah, it's another game at home. That doesn't necessarily help you, but it's another game at home, and if you can get a team like Kansas State and you beat them, that only helps you. And so I think if you've got to be able to build on this momentum. So look, I as I said, like my pessimism is saying that Utah's not an NCAA tournament team, and I don't think that that's too far of a stretch, right? Like, this isn't a hot take that I'm coming to you and you're like, wow, Josh, this is ridiculous. Like, how do you not see this? Like, no, I think a majority of people are saying that. The hot take would be that Utah is an NCAA tournament team. And, well, I don't think that's going to happen. I'm saying that there is a possibility, but it's very, 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 very slim. And it's so many things would have to happen. So we'll see. Take it game by game, see how it goes, see what the Big 12 tournament looks like, all that kind of stuff, and see how this team finishes. So we'll see. But that's it for the Runnin Utes. They get Kansas State tonight. This is more of a traditional Big 12 type team, guard play. Curious to see Utah and how they handle this with just a day off in between, and kind of what that momentum will be. Will you get fans in the building that are going to support the team? Utah's had surprisingly a lot more fans this year than I thought they would. Kansas, they were always going to have fans there, right? BYU, they were always going to have fans. But I think there's been an opportunity to support the team. Granted, I still think there needs to be more support from the student section. That showed out again at Kansas, and that worked great. But I think, that can be kind of the heartbeat of a team. If you can get a good student section, everything else will kind of come together. Now, obviously, they have to perform on the court, but I think getting that support helps. So if you're a student listening to this, go to the game. What else you got on a Monday night, right? You got nothing. You didn't have school. It's President's Day. So get going to the games. That's just my piece. Look, if you're in college and you're into basketball at anything, like, why aren't you at the games? That's just all I'm saying. Granted, it's not my money, so that's it. So let's move on. Let me tell you a little bit more about one of our partners, You First Credit Union. With You First Rewards checking account, you can earn monthly reward points by buying something special for your best friend. Then you can redeem your rewards points for something special for yourself. And with no monthly maintenance fees plus free ID theft protection, you can love that the You First Rewards checking is big on perks and peace of mind. Put your checking account to work for you so you can spend more time doing more rewarding things. It's easy rewards checking with You First Credit Union. Check out the full details at youfirstcu.com. All right, let's talk about the women's team now. This women's team, as we talked about the men's with the NCAA tournament, this is an NCAA tournament team. And this is a team that is absolutely finding its stride. Are they perfect? No. They still have some things that they have to work on, but this is a very efficient team that is finding a lot of success. They're hitting a rhythm of being able to have somebody like Gianna Neepkins, Kennedy McQueen, Maya Torre, Maddie Wilkie, all of these players kind of finding a rhythm where they can be hot. And you had a game where they traveled to Arizona State. They beat Arizona State last time, if I remember right. It was 102-82 or something like that. It was a 20-point win at home. It was, by all accounts, it seemed easy, right? But games change, teams change later on in the season, and this is one of the rare teams that Utah will play twice this year. And Utah just put them to the test, right? And really challenged them. Utah was hitting three-pointers at a high rate. They had 11 at the first half. This was a team that really came into the game and did well. Now, this Utah team is kind of funny because, they won 98-62. Anyways, so this is a team that they kind of have this thing where they start out really hot in the first quarter. They come out there. It's usually Maya Toure really dominating the post, setting the tone, 7, 9, 10 points, whatever it may be, sometimes more, sometimes less. But Utah usually sets that early tone, builds up a big lead, and then in the second quarter, they just kind of take their foot off the gas and they kind of squander it a little bit. And then they go into shooting slumps. And it's been kind of interesting to watch because it's been a consistent theme for the last at least 3, 4, 5 games that I've seen where this is the case, where the second quarter they go in a slump, and then at the very end, the last 2 minutes, they go on like an 8-0 run, 10-0 run, something like that, and then it's this lead at halftime that they then just continue to blow up into the second half. So it's been really fascinating to watch, but that's kind of been Utah's MO the last few games. However you get it done, Utah won by 36 points, so you can't really be frustrated by that. It's a game where a lot of players got to play. There's a lot of progression being made with some of these other players. I have to give a shout out to Brooke Walker, who, freshman, you watch her and you come in and watch some of these freshmen who are getting more time than anybody else. And it's tough, right? Like you see kind of the look on her face where she's clearly talented enough to be able to be on that floor, but she has to believe it. And I think you're starting to see that more with her. You're starting to see her have a lot more belief in herself where she's playing much more carefree. It was the same way with Reese Ross last year. You could see the potential. You could see that there was something there where she's going to be athletic and she's going to be a person that's going to just absolutely dominate in the game, but it's all believing in yourself and having that confidence to know that you can be on the floor. And you're starting to see that with somebody like Brooke Walker. So future-wise, I think you've got something there. And, little shout-out to her because I really have seen a lot of progress with what she's been able to do. So anyways, your mainstays here in this game were your big deciders, right? Like Gianna Neepkins, who's been on a tear recently. She finished with 24 points, was 4 of 7 from deep, had 12 rebounds, double-double machine lately. She's been able to be very effective. And the thing about Gianna is like everybody has looked at her through her career, obviously somebody who can create her own shot, but she's somebody that is just a spot up 3-point shooter, right? Like she's quick with the trigger. She's able to go and get there, but she, especially this year, is finding so many different ways to score. And that backdoor cut that she continues to go with, it's just been deadly for teams because they sit there and they try to defend her on the 3-point line. So they play her up, but then all it takes is having somebody like Maya at the top of the post, give her a look off, and then suddenly she breaks in for that backdoor cut, and it's an easy, lane to the rim. So Gianna's continually finding ways to score. You can take her off of her game, and she'll still find a different way to be able to do it. But more importantly, Utah has so many other players that have been able to be effective, so that Gianna's going to be at the top of the scouting report, right? Like everybody knows going into that game, you have to take her away. The problem is if you do take her away and let's say you double her or you try to limit, her 3-point shots, whatever that may be, she's a great passer and she can also find somebody else. And there's other people on the team that can do it. Kennedy McQueen, 20 points. She had 6 3-pointers in that game. It's incredible. She had 3 rebounds, but she was mostly the spot-up shooter that just kind of hit from deep. And so even though Gianna was doing what she did, Kennedy finds herself in so many open opportunities because they're so focused on Gianna that she's just got this great opportunity to hit. And that was the difference last year. Kennedy was put into a role where she had to try to be the Gianna, right? Where she was going to get the number 1 defender. She was the one that had the best opportunity of being able to create their own shot, who wasn't Alyssa Peely. And Peely was much more of a post player, so that's a different type of game, right? Now you're starting to see Kennedy in her role where you give her that ball off of the wing and whatever it may be. Like she's going to do some damage, and it's going to be tremendous. At the same time, as I've talked about in the last few episodes of this podcast, Kennedy McQueen and Gianna Neepkins are 2 of the only 3 players in the country that are in the 50-40-90 club, and they continue to actually improve there. So they're continually staying there. They're doing it at a high rate, with only a few more games left in the regular season, and that shows how efficient this team can be. But, as much as we talk about these 2, and they have been tremendous, Maddie Wilkie put in a quiet performance where at the end of the game, you look at her stat line, and it was pretty solid. She had 18 points. She was 4 of 8 from 3-point line. She had 2 rebounds. She was just all over the floor, and is a third player that is just outside of that 50-40-90 club. The only thing that she hasn't met is the field goal percentage, and she's at 48.3. So she's there. Obviously has to hit a little bit higher. But if you can get 3 players, no less one, but 3 players that are in that mix, it kind of shows to the level of efficiency that this team can be. And so does that translate to wins? Not always, right? But if you're going to have efficient shooters and they shoot the ball at a high rate, generally speaking, you're going to do well with that, right? And so there's going to be games where that ball doesn't fall right. And it's going to be tough for Utah. And you're going to have to rely on somebody like a Maya Torre, who still got 12 points and 8 rebounds in that game. You're going to have to rely on Jenna Johnson. You're going to have to rely on somebody else to be able to get things done at times. But that's the nature of this Utah team. You're obviously going to default to Gianna, Kennedy, Maddie. If they're hitting those shots, it's great, right? And especially if you get Reese Ross hitting shots, or Sam Crisp has been hitting shots. Maya Torre has been hitting deep shots. Jenna Johnson's been hitting those deep shots. All of them can do it. But if you can get them involved as well, then it just helps tremendously. But this Utah team is built where they can generally sustain that in the post as well. If you go to Maya, if you go to it just depends on how this team is made up. Now, that's not to say it's perfect. If Gianna and Kennedy aren't hitting, or if Maddie's not hitting as well, it's going to be much more of a struggle, and it's going to be a much more tight game. And I think that's where Utah really struggles, is when those shots don't fall. But right now, it's working, and they're hitting a stride that looks completely different from what they've been in. They hit 18 three-pointers. It's a season high, but just a few games before, they hit 16, which was a season high. You're starting to see them find that rhythm and that chemistry and being able to hit at a high level. Now, with that being said, they have an incredibly tall task going up on Tuesday against Oklahoma State. Now, this Oklahoma State team, they did lose to BYU on Saturday, and BYU has just not been a great team in women's basketball this year. They have some pieces. Delaney Gibb, a phenomenal freshman who every single week that I have to vote on this, I try almost to not vote for her, because there's just, I want to be able to disperse it out to other people, but it's hard. Like, she consistently has the best stats. She's doing the most with it. Her team isn't always winning, but at the same time, her individual performance has been at a high level. And so there's players on that BYU team that obviously can do well. They did enough to keep the game close, despite having a billion turnovers in that game, and they still beat Oklahoma State. Oklahoma State wasn't shooting at a high enough rate, and a lot of other things happened. But this is an Oklahoma State team that has been one of the hotter teams as of late in the Big 12, a team that was really making some noise. I'm curious to see how this game goes, but this is one of those games where Utah has all of the world in front of it, right? They're pretty much a lock in the NCAA tournament. I mean, I guess if you go on a big losing streak over the next 2 weeks and fail to perform in the Big 12 tournament, maybe things change. But I think this is a team that's a lock. You obviously want to be able to sustain that success and be able to move forward. But this is a good team, right? Like, they're a team that is just outside of maybe a top 4 seed in the NCAA tournament. And obviously that would be the most important thing for them. If they can go on and do that, that would help this Utah team a lot. I think they're, if you can get that first 2 rounds, excuse me, of the NCAA tournament in Salt Lake City, that changes everything for Utah. And I think that becomes a game changer. You found last year, you win the first game and then you run into a buzzsaw against Gonzaga. That's just the nature of it. You're in their home floor where they just don't lose. That's where it becomes a challenge. And so if Utah can make these strides, beat Oklahoma State, beat Washington or West Virginia on the road, if you can potentially go deep in the Big 12 tournament, right now Utah's close. They're a 4 seed right now, so they would be a 2-game bye. If they can continue to stay in those top 4 teams, that's going to be a ton. That's going to mean a lot for Utah moving forward. So, really fascinated to see how this team goes. We've seen it in years past where they get into the Big 12, or we'll call it conference tournament, Pac-12 in years past, where they get those buys and it just kind of shoots themselves in the foot because you're going up against a team that's built momentum from the night before. So it can be a double-edged sword at times where you get the rest, but then you're running up against a team that may be hot, right? So this is just a team that has to continue to fight. But more or less, this is a team that hasn't really had much of a drop-off under Gavin Peterson. And I know that was the biggest worry, right? Lynn Roberts was such an advocate for this program, and she was a great coach who was able to do a lot of things to be able to get Utah to where it is. And a lot of people, for whatever reason, didn't really view Gavin in that same light. And granted, as the assistant coach, it's really easy to kind of, coast on those coattails, so to speak. But at the same time, this is a guy that was fully engaged in it as well. He knows his game. He's done a great job where he's been able to coach at a high level. He's gotten these players to be able to continue to improve. And so you're seeing that where he can take those reins and continue to run with it, right? Lynn gave him his full support, or her full support, excuse me. That's, she should. He's been there for 10 years, but that doesn't always mean that an assistant coach can just step into that role and succeed. And it's easy to say, oh, well, they already had the players, and yeah, we'll have to see how this develops in years future. But at the same time, it's real easy in some of these games to lose. And he's found a way to go beat the number 3 team at the time, Notre Dame, which is now number 2, unless the rankings change today, but I haven't had a chance to look at those. But you've got a coach that has been able to be effective and to continually pushes these women to be able to be at their next level, right? He knows exactly everything about them. He's been with them for a long time, and so it's been a great opportunity to see. So for now, winning over Arizona State's not going to necessarily change anything. Obviously, beating them by 36, that, maybe that gives you a better look. But at the same time, you've got to now go beat Oklahoma State at home on Tuesday. You've got to be able to do that. You can't have another one of these where, Utah's on the fringe of being ranked, or they are ranked, and then you go lose to another team like Kansas State. Now, granted, Kansas State was a phenomenal team. Utah had a terrible amount of turnovers. That's been their biggest flaw this season is turnovers. And if they can cut those down, and most of these are unforced errors, they're bad passes, they're things that Utah can absolutely control. But if they can cut those down, this absolutely becomes a tournament team and one that could easily get back to the Sweet 16. So is it as good as the year that they, went up against LSU, which was the eventual champion? I don't know. We'll see. They're built differently. But I think they have the ability to be able to do that. And, if you can, especially if you can fight to get that top 4 seed in the NCAA tournament and get the host seed, that changes everything for Utah. That obviously becomes a game changer where you now get your fans there. It helps a ton. Instead of last week, you were slated to go to LA and play USC, the number 2 team. That's a disaster. You don't want that early. So if you can get out of those lower seeds or even those middle seeds where, you're kind of stuck against some of the top teams in the country early on, that bodes well for you. So that's it. So that's this episode went a little longer than I was expecting. I had a lot of other things that we can talk about, and maybe I can do some on Thursday or later in this week. But we're gonna wrap this one up today. A lot to talk about. As I said, things are going well at the University of Utah. Depending on how your fandom is, you're either really happy right now, maybe you're cautiously optimistic, maybe you're just looking forward to football. I don't know what it is, but we'll talk about it all. So I appreciate you listening to me. Hope you have a great week, and we'll potentially get back later in this week to talk maybe a little bit more technical stuff on some things happening, Utah laws or some settlement stuff that could change Utah's future in athletics. So with that, we'll sign off today. I appreciate it. Thank you so much for listening, and have a great day.